Well, welcome back. Still to come, lots more this afternoon. We're going to be talking about diversity and leadership with one of the industry's leading headhunters. We'll be hearing from the chief executive of Waymo, and then obviously we have the Meet the Journalist session coming up later today as well. But right now we're going to take a look at self-driving cars. They're coming, but what are the rules that govern them? And what about the intelligence that drives them? I'm going to be joined by our four panelists now. Now, during this session, please do keep your questions coming into the question box. We will get to those as they come in. I'm going to introduce our panel now. They are Volker Hartmann, who's the head of quality at Cardot Software inside Volkswagen, William Yavinsky, who is the co-head of the global automotive industry sector group at Hogan Lovells, Jessica Uguccioni, who works at the Law Commission in England and Wales inside the Ministry of Justice, and Alisyn Malek, who's the Executive Director for the Commission on the Future of Mobility, who joins us from Detroit. And they will, by magic, all appear on the screen together. Everybody, thank you for being with us this afternoon, and for some of you this morning from where you are. Look, I want to start with just a general question. What are the biggest legal challenges that the industry faces in order to get automated cars on the roads? Jessica, can I start with you?
Thank you so much, Peter. Yeah, I think one of the biggest shifts is just the way that we regulate road traffic. It's all emerged around the human driver, whereas now with self-driving vehicles, we really need to think about regulating corporations instead. So if you, for example, today have a human driver running a red light, that's a very self-contained and specific issue, and we might give them a fine. But the same thing happens with a self-driving car. Suddenly it becomes imperative to take prompt action to maybe, prevent it happening again in case it's an issue that might repeat. Maybe the whole fleet might be affected. So you need to have a much more dynamic relationship with regulation. It's not something that you can deal with, with a fine 30 days after the fact. And a lot of stuff flows from that. But I think that's one of the really big changes that we need to think about when we're regulating self-driving.
Shouldn't they, I'm not a technologist, but shouldn't the cars be programmed so that they don't drive through red lights in the first place?
Absolutely, but we have to make sure that actually, is the case. We saw also with testing, for example, I remember in San Francisco when Uber's license got taken away because it was found that its cars were running red lights, although of course it's testing, but these systems are not perfect. That's why we've got a safety assurance scheme in place. And when you need to have monitoring, because as much as you might have designed a vehicle to act in a particular way, we have to be sure that in the wild and in reality, it's delivering what it's meant to. And of course, roads are chaotic. They change. Road users change. And we have to make sure that what we designed for actually eventuates in practice.
Yeah, and the point that human drivers don't obey the rules, and so if robot drivers obey the rules rigidly, they'll actually stick out, not driving through red lights as they're changing. William, can I come to you next? What are your thoughts on this?
So I'd say thank you, Peter, and thanks for having me in the panel today. Really pleasure to be here with the whole group. At Hogan Lovells, where we represent clients that are OEMs, suppliers, and new entrants and investors in the sector, we really see the legal challenges that are emerging as feeding into what we like to call living mobility, and the broader considerations that will impact life as we know it, interacting with different modes and methods of transportation, including, of course, autonomous vehicles and artificial intelligence. And when we see those participating in the sector thinking about how they're going to deliver these technologies and the policies that will need to be developed to accommodate them, we like to think of it as having to address objectivity, inclusivity, sustainability, and a unifying experience for consumers and those of us interacting with the technologies. So, for example, thinking about just objectivity, if you're thinking about artificial intelligence, greater transparency, encouraging greater consumer trust, and thinking about how is that data going to be used and managed in connection with the user experience.
And how does the situation over there change? Because obviously you've got the federal setup and you've got the state setup, and you've got these different sets of rules that you have to balance constantly. How much of a challenge is that when you're looking at all the future rules that will govern this area?
So it is, and I'll welcome. I know Alisyn on the U.S. policy side is very in tune with this as well. But you certainly do see a developing process that is at both the federal level, where we have had some stalls in U.S. federal legislation, such as the proposed Self-Drive Act, whereas individual states have, as Jessica was saying, we're referring to Uber in San Francisco and local governments seeking to manage these testing programs and have encourage the development of these important industries in competition with other markets. I do think we can, as we look ahead to a new administration in the U.S., I think we can expect policy shifts under a Biden administration to impact the sector, including in the areas of AI and autonomous vehicles.
Perfect, thank you.
I think
Alisyn,
to add on to that, yeah. As we think about in the U.S., the federal government is what regulates the vehicle design. The states usually manage the driver. And as the vehicle becomes the driver, that's the gray area that we're in. And figuring out how historic policy has figured out how to manage hardware, how to think about hardware as we think about corporate liability and recalls and things of that nature. Thinking about software that is less deterministic is really the gray area that we're in now. And being able to put together a regime where everyone agrees, this is the bar that you have to reach in order for something to be perceived as safe and safe enough to scale out on public roads. And so as we think about what needs to happen in policy, we absolutely have to figure out criminal law and things like that, which apply even as we're in these testing modes. And what will hold us back from really seeing these technologies change how we move around at scale is going to be figuring out that answer to how safe is safe enough to start manufacturing vehicles in the thousands and then the millions.
But is it the case that even before we get to the how safe is safe enough question, which we are going to tackle and possibly even answer in this session, isn't it the point that we actually have to work out who makes the rules, who enforces the rules, as a hurdle you have to clear before you can even get to deciding what those rules are? I mean, how much of a barrier, is that process to have before we get onto the rules themselves?
I think that's a good point in terms of who makes the rules. I think generally I'm more familiar with U.S. policy, and here, when it comes to physical vehicle design, the federal government makes the rules. And so I think where you see a lot of questions, and frankly, having worked closely with state regulators in previous roles, there's a lot of hard stuff for policymakers to try to understand when it comes to autonomous vehicles. And so I think I've seen a little bit less of a battle of who gets to make the rules. There's really just a desire to who's going to figure out the expertise to be able to make the rules. And generally that takes resources, and generally that's a little bit easier to do at a collective scale. But figuring out how we can make sure that the people that are trying to make the rules have access to be able to understand the technology, have access to be able to understand how it's used is going to be really critical. And at the local level, a lot of the questions end up coming around not just how do we make sure that it's safe for our constituents, but then also how is the technology being used? Is it serving everybody? And I think that is another area as we think about the paradigm shift that comes from autonomous and AI technologies and how we get around is going to be another really critical area of policy is how is it used and who is it serving?
That's such an interesting point, particularly around whether politicians actually understand what the technology is about. I remember a couple of years ago, the then transport secretary arriving at a conference I was at in a Tesla and coming on stage and telling everybody excitedly how he was able to drive along the roads without having his hands on the wheels, which was about a week after we'd had a fatal accident in Florida where someone had exactly that happening, and everyone in the audience was completely horrified that he would even try and make this suggestion. So that is definitely a hurdle that has to be cleared. Volker, can I come to you next? Look, what are your thoughts on the big challenges, particularly kind of around legal definitions going into this?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. So I believe the field is huge. The technological complexity, which merges here into certain questions and uncertainties when we look into the legal and regulatory framework, this is really a strategic factor. I believe it's one of the big strategic factors which needs to be considered by developers, manufacturers, when thinking about deploying such technology into the market. And what I see is that, and this is a little bit coming back to your earlier question, apologies for that, but reducing also the complexity on the legal and regulatory level would be also critical. You know, if you program software and you want to be compliant with 27 different jurisdictions in the European Union or 50 different state jurisdictions in the US, and you have a lifetime responsibility, product monitoring, end to end, you have to track that. You have to monitor, understand, interpret, update all this, and you have to control and manage this kind of complexity. This is really something where I feel we have a way to go. We have to explain to policymakers, educate people, first on an expert level, and then, of course, educating society to find and create acceptance that we need probably a more unified and more consistent approach when it comes to the legal framework. Otherwise, this is so complex. I'm moving in this field since 5-6 years, and I can tell you, if you try to bring this into a requirement management to create a product, looking into China, EU, US, you're gonna get crazy. It's really complex.
So if you look at the potential deployment of autonomous vehicles, and let's just take the example of ride hailing for the moment, right, and leave out sort of long distance autonomous freight. All of those vehicles are going to be deployed in a set area, probably in one city or one city and its surrounding suburbs. Do you really need to have consistent rules then, you know, from different states, different cities, different countries across the EU? Does it really matter, you know, from an actual legal and regulatory point of view?
I mean, of course, you can create these kind of, protected bubbles, I call them. And this is also, it's an important aspect in your strategy, in your go-to-market strategy, because there you can show that the technology works. There you can show that a certain framework works together with the technology, with the product in use. And this is super important. So you have a point, absolutely. But if you look into the, economical potential of this technology, I believe it's super important that we address that there's a lot of more business cases beyond a taxi, robo shuttle driving in suburbs of one specific city. This is nice. This is cool. But I mean, COVID showed it. We do have an issue when it comes to logistics. When it comes to international logistics, we have to keep that up. And you have ships, you have trains, you have planes, of course, but there's also trucks. There's commercial vehicles, smaller commercial vehicles. There's going to be delivery robots. And all this is something which requires a much broader scope, and you cannot limit yourself to one city or one community, one region to have success in the end.
Can I come in on that, actually? Because that's one of the big difficulties that we are thinking about in terms of determining how safe is safe enough. Because somebody, whether it be a politician, as Alisyn said, federal government in the US, and here also Secretary of State, they'll have to sign off on a vehicle and say, we're happy to have it on our roads. But the number of fatalities that different jurisdictions accept in road safety are very, very different. So a vehicle that is vastly improving road safety in China will not be vastly improving road safety necessarily here, because the number of fatalities that we accept, in our road traffic is much, much lower. So the idea of having positive risk balance and all these different tests which have been put forward by industry and that academics are considering, like Rand Corporation, in terms of applying them in different places, you can't have a one size fits all, because we all have such different cultural acceptance and frankly, just a different benchmark. If we have, over 1,700 fatalities a year, say here in the UK each year, if that were to jump up with AVs, accounting for 100% penetration, I'm just making, a one-for-one assessment, that would just not be acceptable. So I'm just wondering how, for Volker or as well, in terms of rolling out to all these different places, how do you account for that kind of difference in the road safety records?
Okay, so, you have an important point. Absolutely. What I was aiming for is you have this very diverse situation in road traffic law. And road traffic law, this is something we have to understand. This is today it addresses to the human driver. Tomorrow, the road traffic law is going to translate into a technical description. It's going to be, in fact, a part of the technical regulatory framework, how this product, how this machine has to work. Okay, and first, if with the first step, I would aim for getting this in a more uniform model. You know, this is the example I've used with 27 different countries in the EU, 50 states in the US. But you are right, this is only the first part of the game. Then you have several other criteria like the social acceptance, cultural aspects, and this differs from country. And I'm not saying I want to program one world software. I would be super happy if we could use probably through master versions, one for China, one for the European markets, and one for North America. And then you have to have adoptions. And the question, what is safe enough, is the $1 million question. I mean, nobody has the perfect answer. And there also you need a social contract, I would call it, you know, with policymakers and other stakeholders. What is the acceptable degree, and what is our strategy towards bringing this technology into the markets and spreading the use of them?
Does anyone have a view on what the acceptable level will be? Alisyn, how about you?
That's the $1 million question. I think if we go sort of how we use transportation today and do the same thing, just swap it out one for one, I think we have to see performance that's better than humans. If we think more broadly about how this technology can operate and if it's actually able to improve access to transportation, I think that social contract actually, where we should hope that it would be better than humans, but it could change. So if all of a sudden every elderly person whose keys got taken away has transportation now, that's a great thing. They can get to doctor's appointments. When we're post-COVID, they'll be able to go visit friends and family, which is a huge help for quality of life. But that could mean more people on the roads, which would statistically end up meaning maybe more incidents. But when we think about that trade-off, I think it's going to be really important for all of us to be clear about what are we getting? What are we getting in exchange for having this technology out on our roads? And making sure and trying to think through that what we're getting is valuable to us as a society. I think if it's just a one-for-one switch, it's going to be a really, really tough line to walk. If we can really use this to open up new business models and things like that are giving more people access, I think it really changes the equation for how we think about what the impact should be.
William.
And just Peter, if I may, just to add on to what Alisyn is saying there, you know, I think the values, you know, as to how safe is safe enough, these concepts of inclusivity that Alisyn's mentioning in terms of, you know, broader sections of our population having access to transportation are part of a changing calculation that is certainly being impacted by the COVID pandemic, certainly being impacted by, you know, I think a shift toward greater interaction with, living mobility, as we'd say. But, I think it's operating also in parallel to, as Volker was saying, you know, the determination of what's going to be the business case that helps increase investment in the sector more broadly. We're already seeing a lot of willingness by major OEMs, top tier suppliers to partner with each other, partner with new entrants, take a lot of risk for being a part of this next movement forward. And I think there's a level of acceptance that it's not going to be a perfect system at first, and there may be some market specific opportunities that need to be pursued before a more standardized approach can come into focus.
Okay, so here's the issue that I think everyone has talked about: calculations, social contracts, and all these kind of, possible benefits that people might accept because they outweigh, the risks of danger on the roads from this. But if you look at, say, for example, the media coverage that happened of the fatal Uber accident, and you look at the media coverage that happened of the fatal Tesla accident using, admittedly, not fully autonomous technology, but in the eyes of many people, self-driving capabilities. Do you really think that society will allow any deaths at all to come from this, right? If 1.2 million people globally die on the roads through road accidents, are we really going to get to a position where the global society says, it's okay for robots to kill only 200,000 people a year on the roads?
I would agree.
Jump in here.
Oh, sorry.
I was working at an automaker when some of those incidents happened, and to be honest, the reaction was actually significantly more muted than we would have expected. And so the examples that you brought out, where yes, people are concerned about the fact that these accidents could happen, the fact that some of those vehicles were not immediately taken off the road and some are still on the road with very similar software tells most people in at least the product development world, which I know better than I do policy, that the tolerance for those types of things is actually higher than we would have expected.
Okay, that's fascinating. Maybe the media should be more excited. Jessica, can I come to you?
Yeah, I think one of the concerns we've had is that, of course, there's a real tendency to blame the human in these situations. So although, of course, these technologies are quite advanced, as you were also saying, Peter, the Teslas, they're not self-driving yet. And when something goes wrong, in the end, it's always blamed on the driver using the system inappropriately, or, with testing, it's the safety driver that didn't, pay sufficient attention. And so I feel like at the moment, society still has a quite clear outlet for the blame that they might want to be allocating on the individuals that might be involved. I think there might be a bit of a difficulty in step change when you remove that clear avenue to an individual. Here in the UK, government did a consultation in 2016 into 2017 about reforming road traffic offences, and people were all up for them being much more serious. They wanted to up the penalty for dangerous driving from 14 years to life imprisonment and add new offences for causing serious injury for careless driving. So there's you also see this current of sentiment which really wants accountability and doesn't really accept things going wrong on the road, and much less by a robot compared to a human who you might empathize with and forgive compared to, say, a big corporation. So I think from an acceptance point of view, I think there might well be challenges we haven't quite yet fully grappled with.
What is the government's current thinking, right, in the UK about what level it is likely to accept? Because we had heard that there were going to be automated trials. We might even have autonomous vehicles on the road by 2021. Is that still going to happen? What's the government's thinking about how safe those have to be?
I mean, trials in the UK are happening already, as you know. I mean, apart from the COVID implications, of course, which made it much more difficult to have, the two safety drivers that most companies wish to use for their testing. My impression is that, a bit like coming back to what Alisyn was saying, it's this idea of making sure that their decisions are informed by evidence and that they have a solid and evidence base about what research is saying, both about technical capabilities and also increasingly about human factors. And I think that is really an emerging field, the importance of which is really getting to be recognized much more fully, because it's not just about how the system behaves, but it's how the humans interacting with the system, overall. What does that mean for safety? Because a system might be designed in a way that on its own terms is fine, but if humans misunderstand it, if they over-rely on it, and all sorts of other things which humans do, then the overall safety of the system is compromised. So, for example, the next, I think, question that is actually practical and will be coming up is, what do we do with automated lane keeping systems, which have been approved at the UN level in June and are going to be possibly, approved in 2021, as soon as then. And the Secretary of State is going to have to make a decision about whether it actually adds those systems onto its list of vehicles which are classified as self-driving. And it put out a call for evidence. The results have not come out yet. It closed in October. But from our conversations and also the publicly available responses to it, it's very split. You have stakeholders that think, yes, this is an example of self-driving. It should totally be listed. Others would say, absolutely not safe enough to allow a driver to stop paying attention. We're not comfortable with the driver stopping to pay attention for a system that can't change lane, for example. So that's a very practical question that's going to come up.
And that's the big split that we've seen in the industry, in the last few years. About half the car makers think that they want to have this system where the driver drives themselves for part of the time and then is able to switch back off and on again. And the other half think it's fundamentally unsafe and don't want anything to do with it. And there's a real split in the industry, which is going to make it interesting, right? When these systems actually hit the road. We have had a lot of questions coming in. That's probably not totally surprising given the topic. There's a question coming in: how are OEMs looking at their liability risk with the shift to autonomous cars? Do they suddenly become liable for how their cars drive themselves? Volker, can I come to you first on this?
Yeah, sure. So, I believe the industry's perspective on this is that everyone understands that this is going to happen. If you produce a machine which is able to do more than traditional vehicles were able to do, it's just logical that the responsibility increases. The interesting thing is, and this is also part of my job actually, what kind of processes, measurements, and steps can you create on a manufacturer level to reduce, mitigate, and successfully manage these kind of risky products? In the end, it's a risky product, and there are many, many risky products on the market. Go into your kitchen, there's a knife, it's a risky product. The big question is, how do you deal with it as a manufacturer, as a user, as a society? And we try to do everything, of course, to make that as safe as possible. We have these gray areas we've been discussing earlier, and there's the last 2%, I feel it's like, it's the moonshot. Yeah, and you really have to find definitions and educate people and explain yourself. In the end, it's a decision of many stakeholders if you allow that or not. Yeah.
And I would think, Peter, how the OEMs seek to allocate risk that they are facing themselves may be different from how they've allocated other risks coming from products that in some cases are supplied by top tier and other further down the chain suppliers. To the extent that that the OEMs are not developing these systems entirely in-house, they're not going to be in a position to, I would think in most cases, I think it's going to be more of a collective conversation with their suppliers around how to allocate the risk among them, rather than sort of, what could be the case for a more traditional part or system that, if this, from a product liability perspective, that if it leads to damage, that there's a pass through of that liability.
We've had several questions come up on everybody's favorite autonomous car topic, which is the trolley problem of whether the autonomous cars kill one group of pedestrians or another's, or kill the driver. Now, obviously, it's going to be difficult to answer this question outright, but from a regulatory and legal point of view, is this going to be something that's going to be left up to the car makers, or is it going to be something that's going to be regulated? That if you want an autonomous car on the road in our market, then you have to program it to protect the driver over the pedestrian, or vice versa. Jessica, can I come to you first on this, and then Alisyn, I'd like your thoughts.
Yeah, we get the trolley problem a lot. It's obviously something high on people's minds, and we need to have a serious conversation about how we think we can deal with it. I think it's about changing the nature of the question, to be honest, because we don't think, the car is having agency anymore. It's a product, interacting with its surroundings, but it doesn't in itself have agency. So what we need to shift our thinking to is the procedures and the steps which Volker was telling us about in terms of how the company programs and builds its AI versus trying to focus in on what would happen in this particular set scenario, which is improbable, and trying to basically treat an AV as if it was a human in a comparable situation. And for the record, of course, we don't know what the right answer is, even for a human. That's the whole point. There is no right answer with the trolley problem of choosing between one life and another. The law never gets us to choose between one life and another. So it's not a question of that nature. So I think it will boil down to transparency, which is also what Will was saying before at the very beginning, just being very clear about the ways in which vehicles interact with their surroundings, and also focusing more on the processes and the policies in place by these big corporations about how they interact with traffic in a non-deterministic way.
I think Jessica really framed it up well. As we think about those types of situations, if we think about it from a human perspective, although we are very fast computers, we are not the fastest. And so being able to understand and have that transparency in how the technology works, oftentimes in those types of situations where there's a lot going on, for a computer that can process a lot more and take in a lot more information because there's more sensors, it may not be a decision at all. And that's where having that transparency and understanding the framework by which you think through creating a system that's reliable and safe becomes the paramount, as opposed to what happens in the specific instance.
Great, thank you. We've had a question come in on insurance. In many countries, insurance follows the individual, not the vehicle. How is this technology going to change the way that we insure drivers or that we insure cars in total? William, do you want to comment on this first?
I certainly appreciate the question, Peter. I think in terms of I think it goes back in part to the product liability question that we were speaking to before, and thinking about the whole interaction between the legislative framework that the automakers are going to be operating within, thinking about the allocation of potentially even criminal liability in connection with these accidents that may happen. Also think we will need to think about insurance in the context of membership-based access to autonomous vehicles. I see, looking down the road, reservations for memberships in programs that can provide even access. They'll advertise access to insurance along with a membership. So I think the industry participants are still working through this and thinking about how it will change, just because there are so many factors at play that will influence the risk that is being insured against, as well as identifying the risk, the responsibility of the individual versus the vehicle manufacturer.
Perfect. Jessica, I know the government looked at the insurance question when it looked at autonomous vehicles.
Absolutely. That was the first thing that they addressed working alongside the insurance industry. So I mentioned it in the context of the Secretary of State having to make a decision about what counts as self-driving, because we do have a specific insurance framework in the UK for vehicles that have self-driving capability. And so the nature of insurance for that kind of vehicle is completely different than our general motor insurance requirements. So what happens there is if an automated vehicle, it has to be insured. And if it causes an incident, the insurer gets direct responsibility for paying out those damages. So it's not really compensating, in human terms. Usually if a driver does something wrong, the insurance company will cover the driver and pay out. Here it's an actual direct responsibility of the insurance company to make good any damage caused by a self-driving car. Now, of course, that will shift a lot of focus to what does it mean to cause damage. And there is a bit of a difference of opinion about whether it's a fault-based metric, or, for example, if a AV is involved in a pile-up and it's knocked in from the back and bashes into the car in front, did it really cause the accident? So there's going to be a lot of debate there, but we think the courts are well equipped to deal with it. And the fundamental principle that it should be really straightforward for any victim who sort of suffers damage from an automated vehicle to get damage was really the prime consideration for the UK government to put this top of the list in policies, just to make sure that people were not out of pocket and not caught up in endless litigation about all the complexities we've been talking about, because it is incredibly complex, like Volker was saying. So we want to make sure that at least people that might have suffered damage have a very straight and clear route to recovery.
And I guess that's easier even with non-automated cars have got increasing technology in them and monitoring, and they're able to tell exactly how they were driven and what happened, which probably makes that process a little bit easier as well. I want to shift slightly and talk a little bit about AI, which is one of the other topics we've got to cover in this session today. AI itself obviously covers a huge amount of things, but as the vehicles get more intelligent, how can something like that actually be regulated and overseen by regulators, particularly given regulation moves at a certain speed and technology tends to move a little bit faster? Volker, can I come to you first on this question?
Sure. So, AI is, as you mentioned, it's a huge field. We have to differentiate a little bit what exactly we're talking about. As far as I understand, in the context of what we are doing, automated vehicles, we use AI primarily as a tool in developing such technology. That means it's happening within the manufacturer's area. It's not going to happen within the vehicle in a way that the vehicle learns in real time in customer use, and it changes its behavior or so. And I believe this is a very, very important thing to distinguish, because if you would have a uncontrollably mutating system out there, it would be a breach of the regulatory framework. The type approval framework we have today in Europe doesn't allow that. It would also probably stipulate a design defect in product liability means. Yeah, because you have to be able, as a manufacturer, you have to be able to control and be responsible for what your product does look like and what the inherent risks of such products are. And that's the difficult thing with AI. As I believe, as long as you use it as a tool and you have a good quality assurance and a good, organization which checks what goes out into the market, that's okay. That's crucial. If you really deploy a product which changes its behavior and it's then dangerous, or it's becoming more dangerous, that's going to be critical. I see a problem there.
Does that limit? I mean, look, I'm not an AI expert by any stretch of the imagination, which is probably quite clear. But does limiting technology that can change itself limit the way that car makers can actually develop this technology?
Well, I believe not, because from a manufacturer's perspective, you will always have a crucial interest in understanding what is going to happen with your product. I mean, you are responsible as a manufacturer. As a matter of fact, it's not only it's in the law, but it's also the reputation. I mean, people buying a Porsche or an Audi or a Volkswagen expect that these manufacturers are responsible for the product. They buy the quality and the promise of quality, right? And therefore, I see a self-regulating system, you can call it, that manufacturers probably will not use something completely crazy, right?
Perfect, thank you. Alisyn, can I come to you on this? I mean, you obviously think a lot about, not just how, AI might also increase different types of business models. There might be different rules around those as well.
Yeah, so as we think about AI and the role that it can play, there's the value of being able to learn in a dynamic environment. And I think that's the power of it. And so there will be business models that may want to better learn where you take your vehicle. So those that can predict, hey, you're headed on your way home, but we see that you need gas, and we know you need to go get your groceries. So we created, a path for you. That's a simple version of an algorithm that can learn things about you. And I think those types of algorithms are already used in a lot of advertising and things like that. So we're already well exposed to them through Google and Facebook and things like that. And so as we think about how business models will change, I think we're already kind of bumping up against how valuable those systems are or are not, and what types of bounds they need to be put in. And I think a similar, the work being done in advertising today will continue in the mobility business model space, but also being more thoughtful about systems that are used for recognition of people and things, making sure that we have a good framework for diversity of how those systems are trained to be able to better reflect the diversity that we see in the world around us is going to be really critical. That usually is still, sort of product development as opposed to product in field. But that is going to be another space where if we're not careful with how we use the systems and how we develop them, that'll come back to us in the long run.
Perfect, thank you. William, can I come to you next on this question?
Sure. So I think, just building on what Alisyn was saying, and I think she framed it very well, I do think that we can see, I do think that the policy shifts that we'll see with the incoming administration and the Biden administration will be impactful. We're still determining in the U.S. whether at a federal level we're going to have a divided government or a united, the legislative and executive branches of government, aligned with the Democrats in a majority. And in general, Democrats have been more restrictive on data use and more worried about AI in terms of regulatory priorities, and have tended to push forward in other areas such as electrification and EVs, which certainly for other sessions as well in the conference. While at the same time, on the Republican side, there's been more of a sense to be nominally more accepting of risk and willing to pass legislation to advance development in these areas. But I think that where from a policy perspective, where both sides of the at least the political divide in the U.S. would unite is they look across the Pacific to China, and they see that even though we've been friends with China since the 70s, sometimes friends disagree, and you have you look at policy actions and the encouragement of local governments under China's strategy of innovation and development of intelligent vehicles from earlier this year. You see similar programs, and I think you're going to see a sense that from the U.S. side, there's going to be a tendency to put in place policy actions that are intended to preserve the nation's technology leadership in AI and the capacity to continue developing it and employing it, as well as to preserve the jobs in manufacturing and development that will arise from it.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, it's always helpful, isn't it, when you're having a discussion about technology and the security of technology, to have a live reminder that it doesn't always work seamlessly. So, Jessica, I'm delighted you're back with us again after 30 seconds blackout. Can I come to you on this question where we're talking about AI and data, and just really picking up on what William said, what's the UK government's view on this whole issue?
Well, I think we've been thinking carefully about how the safety assurance scheme can possibly work, with these systems, which are so much more complex, and where, frankly, the corporations and the developers have such a greater knowledge of their systems than the regulators ever can. So how can you have meaningful oversight? And I think what it ends up bringing us to is this need for a blend of third-party testing, but also some reliance on self-certification. And then that puts a lot of onus on transparency once again, and just making sure that there is a clear communication of what it is that the companies are doing in terms of making sure these vehicles are safe. But you need a much more flexible way of looking at all the data inputs, and also a much more ongoing relationship with the regulators. So it's not just a one-off sign off on a particular system, but even as Volker said, where the development happens in-house and is pushed out by the corporation rather than emergent behavior in the field, you still need to have quite a responsive regulatory scheme that is able to deal with software updates, and having a process whereby vehicles can be updated in a way that is meaningful and sufficiently fast to be useful.
What does that mean for the actual, structure and function of regulators? Does that fundamentally change because you need to be obviously a lot more agile? Do they need to be even, embedded in the companies that they're regulating?
I don't know about being embedded, because I think there would be a conflict of interest element, of course, emerging there. But I think in all these industries, and indeed we've seen it also with pharmaceuticals recently, that people are a bit uncomfortable by how close the regulators might be, World Health Organization versus pharmaceutical companies. And I think it's just a challenge where the knowledge base is just not with the regulators, and it just can never be, because the innovators that are working in the field are in the company. So we need to find a good way to work together. But I think it is important to maintain separate roles. And indeed, I think the corporations want that, because they don't want to have all the responsibility for figuring out what the thresholds are. So they need support that is external and clear, but also very permeable and that listens to them. I mean, that's the messages we've been getting from the companies we've been speaking with.
Volker is nodding along there. Do you have views on this, Volker?
Yeah, thanks. It might sound a little bit strange, but as a guy from the industry, I can only agree. I mean, we don't say regulation is bad. The contrary is the case here. With all that the complexity which we've discussed during the past discussion, we need good regulation. We need a good framework, an adequate framework which does not hinder technology per se, but which gives safeguards, which gives orientation. So far in my personal career, I did not meet any engineer building such technology who was not interested in doing something positive for the human race and for society, but people are looking and seeking for orientation. They want to have a framework which tells us, yes, this is the set of requirements you have to fulfill, and then you are on the 98% side, right? And then there is life, and something is going to happen. But we have to decide then if we accept that 2% risk or whatever you call it. I'm not saying it's exactly 2%. Don't get me wrong, but yeah, and against that background, it's absolutely crucial. It's absolutely crucial. This is also in our interest, and it's the reason why we closely collaborate and try to participate in the discussion with regulators and policymakers all over the world.
I just want to pick up on something that Jessica said then, about trust. And actually, we've had a question come in on this. Do consumers fundamentally trust the rule makers, right? History shows that independent rating bodies, if you look, say, for example, in Europe, Euro NCAP is far more trusted as a crash test certifier than the official certifier. And do you think that's something that might be likely to happen when we come to autonomous vehicles, that there's one official set of rules, but everybody in reality holds them to a higher standard?
Yeah, that seems to me like a possibility. It'll be really interesting to see how we do build that trust. I think we'll agree we need it, but finding the ways that can really convince the public is going to be a real challenge. And it will be really great to see different initiatives. And the industry is already doing various consortia, companies that are, strong competitors coming together to try and put forward common ways forward all around the world. That's been happening. So I can see that as a really positive development.
Can I add something? The trust momentum, I believe it's super important, because here this is connected to the political game in the world, the different political regimes we see, the systems, and it's a huge chance for the West, for the Western world, for the US and the European Union specifically, to create trust in regulation for new technologies. The European Union has launched an initiative called Trustworthy AI. And I'm convinced that with the Biden administration, hopefully, we will find parallel approaches on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. And then you can build on the system called democracy and create something which is really trustworthy, a regulation which creates trust. And this is something we then would have as a USP.
Brilliant. Thank you. I want to get a final thought from William and then Alisyn, because we are almost out of time.
Well, just
I think it really will be. Go ahead.
No, you first.
I think trust is really going to be the key, and figuring out the right institutions. And I agree with Volker that the idea that we can have different entities come together and really try to be transparent in how and why we're creating these institutions is going to be important, to be able to make sure that we're bringing public trust, because many people have been investing a lot of time and money into technology, but if we don't have public trust, we won't be able to see the changes bear fruit that we've all been hoping for.
And
Brilliant.
I'll
Thank you,
just
William.
add as a as speaking as an M&A deal lawyer, I like to bring people together, and I think that there, even though we do have divided and separate views across regions as to how much data is able to be provided, I think there will be ways to harmonize, as Volker and Alisyn have been saying.
Perfect. Thank you. We are out of time. Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you to you for your questions. If you still have questions about self-driving cars, and it's possible that you do, then tune in this afternoon to John Krafchick from Waymo, who will be being interviewed by Patrick McGee, and will also be taking your questions about autonomous technology as well. But thank you to Volker, William, Jessica, and Alisyn for that. Next up, don't go away, it's Lawrence Stroll, the man who promises to revitalize Aston Martin. It'll be at 3:10 UK time, 10 past 10 if you're in Detroit. We'll see you after the break.